It would be a strategic and tactical defeat for the United States. It would be a humiliation for the United States.
With no organized opposition networks left intact inside Iran, can a fragmented diaspora lead a successful transition?
They will be defenseless against an Iranian regime, which they know has a long-term plan to invade Saudi Arabia and take over their oil fields.
If Washington backs down and signs another temporary deal with this system, aren't they just guaranteeing a much more brutal nuclear-armed conflict a few years down the line?
There's no indication that the Iranians would give anything more in negotiations that they haven't given under military attack.
Recently, New York Times leaked that Americans and Israelis planners are eyeing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as a potential post-regime leader, or at least they considered him.
The Iranian regime has interpreted President Trump's repeated attempts at ceasefire as nothing but weakness and panic.
Iranian state television broadcasting tutorials on how to handle military-grade assault weapons.
If the United States comes to an agreement and accepts any of the maximalist demands of this regime, it would be terrible for the United States and the vast majority of Iranian freedom-loving Iranians.
Welcome back to Beyond the Summit podcast. Today, we are rejoining a vital voice for this critical moment. Dr. Kian Tajbakhsh is a professor of international relations at NYU, a senior advisor at Columbia University, and a former political prisoner in Iran. Professor Tajbakhsh, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me in there.
Fantastic. With the Western blockade cutting off nearly 90% of the regime's revenue, who do you think blinks first? Tehran running on empty or President Trump facing domestic economic and political pressure?
I think at this point, it's unclear who's going to blink first. And the reason is because there are a number of economic variables that are not well known for us outside of Iran in terms of what the regime secretly controls. That is in terms, for example, of either gasoline reserves, shadow banking networks, which they have through China and potentially through Russia, as certain levels of imports that they can get through Russia and China through the Pakistan overland routes. None of these are certain. I mean, I don't think that they're going to solve, it's very unlikely they will solve the Iranian economic problem, but they may be able to extend the timeline for a matter of weeks and possibly a matter of months. And that is the time constraint that the US is facing. And so I just wanted to throw that out, is that I wish I knew and I had intelligence in terms of these either secret reserves or access to certain financial shadow accounting or the kind of secret dealings that China and Russia are providing at the Islamic Republic to be able to weather this storm. Now, I think at this point, there is a trade-off between the resumption of military attacks and the economic pressure. And let me just explain how I understand that. First of all, the resumption of military attacks, which is possible, but it's very uncertain. And I don't know, because President Trump seems to be just indicating that he needs to get out as soon as possible, even though he says other things, that he doesn't hear, that he's not in a rush or that he has all the time in the world. That these kinds of rhetoric suggests that on the one hand, he's willing to stick with this blockade. On the other, the question is whether he wants to resume military attacks. Now, on the one hand, we should remember that if you remember in the past, Ayatollah Khamenei, the late Ayatollah Khamenei, the former supreme leader, it took him quite a long time to reach a point with the earlier nuclear negotiations where he agreed to undertake what he called heroic flexibility.
Right.
In other words, it didn't come immediately. It took a while. And so maybe the regime itself will take a while before it then says something about heroic flexibility and making compromise and concessions. We don't know about that. The paradox for the U.S. is that external military strikes will weaken the regime more. But according to a number of experts, that will paradoxically give it political cover because it will ease the economic pressure and ease the sense that it has created an domestic economic failure. So the domestic economic pressures on the population, they will be able to deflect that when there is military attacks and say, oh, you see, we're being attacked militarily. That's the reason why the people are facing economic pressure. The blockade, on the other hand, is doing real damage, but it has a double-edged sword. It does suppress market demand, and it suppresses market supply for oil, which increases the price of oil, but then it helps the regime mask inflation in the short term. And so there are these number of and what I'm worried about is that this kind of calibration, this kind of trade-offs is too complicated at the moment. I don't see any indication that the US is, using these trade-offs in the most optimal way. So maybe that's a very complicated answer, but I think that partly explains why we're in this kind of conundrum and this impasse at the moment.
Yeah, you mentioned some great points there. Islamic Republic has shown over and over again when it comes to the matter of time is in their favor. The longer it takes, so they may have more leverage, but this time might be a little bit more complicated. Another point you mentioned is economic pressure. It is obvious that economic pressure on the Iranian people is unbearable right now. Do you expect this to spark a massive uprising or people just focus on pure survival?
I think that this is something that will accumulate over time and that will, in high likelihood, spark protests, economically based protests. But if I had to estimate, I would say not in the short term. In other words, in the short term, the population that is opposed to the regime, the majority of the population that is opposed to the regime, are experiencing two types of shock. One is the shock, first of all, of fear because of the widespread massacre that the regime conducted against unarmed protesters in January of this year.
Right.
I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that. I mean, even when I speak with family, and I do several times a week, friends and family inside Iran, I mean, we always ask, are you safe? How's it like going around the streets and so on and so forth? And they say, well, we try to avoid being anywhere where we could be accused of, let's say, mobilizing or coalescing in the streets because the regime has given the police and the judiciary have given shoot to kill orders against any groups of people that they consider to be opposition, voicing their opposition or mobilizing against the regime.
Right. That being said, why do you think in the middle of everything that we are witnessing, Iranian state television broadcasting tutorials on how to handle military-grade assault weapons, is this fear of ground invasion or fear of Iranian people getting back to the streets?
I think it's both. I mean, remember, okay, so first of all, our listeners should have a map of Iran to get a realistic sense of the large population in Iran. So my estimate, which I use often, Amir, and I think I shared this last time in our conversation, something between 10 and 15% maximum of the population, I would say, support the regime. Half of those are ideological, doctrinaire, even ideological zealots and religious zealots. The other half are beneficiaries, people whose lives and livelihoods depend on the regime, giving them pensions, giving them salaries, their houses, and so on and so forth. So that is not a small number of people. And I think that, 10% of 90 million people, you're talking about 8 or 9 million people who you can mobilize. At the other end of the extreme are 30% of the population that I estimate to be politically passive. They're not engaged in politics. They don't engage in voting. They don't follow politics. They are interested in just survival and safety for their kids and family, and they don't particularly care on what regime that they live under. I mean, they may care, but they're not going to mobilize. The other 50, 60%, maybe 70% of the population opposes this regime, would prefer to live under a different, freer regime, secular and democratic and integrated into the modern Western world. Now, that population, which is the vast majority, of course, are made up of young people and older people who would be afraid to go out into the street. But let's say a significant group of that 50, 60%, 20, 30% maybe, eventually would be willing to come out into the street and protest. But as I said, the two shocks that the population are suffering under right now are the shock of fear of the regime, the massacre of January this year, which the regime, by the way, has said that they will shoot people and kill people that they feel are opposing the regime. And the other shock, of course, is the shock of the war, staying inside because of the bombs, and also trying to just make ends meet, get their kids to school, get the health care, stay safe, stay in the house. So I don't anticipate for the next 6 months for them to be able to come out into the streets. I think that over time, as the economic pressure mounts and the regime is unable to solve those problems, I think a smaller group of people will begin slowly to come out and express their grievances. Whether that sparks widespread rebellion, it's hard to know. It's hard to know if the bombs are still flying at that point, or whether the regime is weak, whether they have people in the streets like Basij checkpoints controlling people. So that's my answer in terms of that. The Iranian state teaching people how to use guns is yes. They are doing that, first of all, as psychological and symbolic show of resistance. That's very important, that they're showing that they are ready to resist. And I think behind the scenes that there are people who are being trained to use guns. They're prepared for that, both against foreign ground invasion, but also against, I think, much more likely against any sort of urban protest against the regime.
Yes, there are some key variables, as you mentioned, that they're hard to predict. Let's say, as an example, if Americans and Israelis start another round of decapitation and main inner circle of decision makers change, they may have different path forward. Let's see how it goes and how things are folding. Another thing is talking about negotiations and talks. Reuters just reported a directive from the current supreme leader stating that enriched uranium must never leave the country. Given the immediate spike in oil prices and bond yields, has Tehran just internationally killed the current peace talks?
I think that the Iranian regime has interpreted President Trump's repeated attempts at ceasefire as nothing but weakness and panic. I mean, whether that's true or not is a different question. But I think to many people inside the United States who are supporters of President Trump, let alone the Iranian regime, which hates the United States and sees itself in a civilizational war, not only a current hot war, but it sees itself in a long-term antagonism with the U.S. They currently read the U.S. tactical decisions to call a ceasefire, which was, I think, April 8th, in the beginning of April this year, and this constant attempt at going back to negotiations as nothing but panic and weakness on the part of President Trump. And, to be honest, it's hard to see it as anything else, partly because there is absolutely no reason. There is no logic to either calling the ceasefire or to repeatedly extending the ceasefire on the part of the United States, because there's no indication that the Iranians would give anything more in negotiations that they haven't given under military attack. Given the fact that I think that the Iranian regime at the moment can only be weakened through military power and economic pressure, I don't see any point in the ceasefire at all. So basically, the Iranian regime makes sense that they would up the ante. They would now see that the United States is not willing to send in ground troops either to secure islands in the Persian Gulf or to send in special forces to retrieve or to secure the enriched uranium, because they haven't been able to even push the Iranians enough to reveal where they are. So in a sense, I would say, yes, I think the Iranian regime is doing the logical thing, which is coming back to seeing the negotiations as an opportunity to up the ante, demand more, and maintain whatever gains they've had around enrichment, which just proves, by the way, that they want a nuclear weapon. But they're just biding their time. If indeed they've been pushed back for 20 years, the regime says, that's fine. We'll wait 20 years to create a nuclear weapon.
Right. So let's talk about GCC country that we all agree they do not have the same weight of influence in ongoing events. Will they stand firm with the West, or will they break rank to cut an emergency peace deal with Tehran to protect their own oil infrastructure?
Yeah, that is a very critical question. I think there is one potential silver lining to this current delay on the part of the United States to resume military operations. And this is just speculation on my part, but it is not unreasonable or implausible. And
Right.
that is that President Trump is seeking to do with the GCC what he feels he succeeded to do with NATO in Europe. And that is to impose greater burden sharing on local partners and allies. He feels he's succeeded in pressing the Europeans to invest more in NATO so that US can maybe shift some of its resources to the Pacific. And now I think the United States does feel that it is time for the rich Arab Gulf countries to be able to increase their investment in their own defense. Now, as I say, that's speculation, but it does seem that we are seeing some things evolve. The UAE, for example, is showing some teeth. It has entered the war, and the Saudi Arabia has, along with the UAE, has reportedly undertaken for the first time offensive military measures against Iran, and for the first time has used its offensive capabilities, not just its military for defensive capabilities. And that is new. And that may indicate a desire for greater coordination. The place of Qatar is not clear because even though it was a supporter of the Islamic regime in terms of mediation. And of course, Qatar is a supporter of Muslim Brotherhood around the Middle East. It's unclear whether they will come together. But I think for the first time, it's become very, very clear that the Arab states had better get together and coordinate themselves. Otherwise, in the future, if the US leaves, they will be defenseless against an Iranian regime which they know has a long-term plan to invade Saudi Arabia and take over their oil fields, which would make the Iranian regime the oil and military hegemon and potentially religious hegemon in the region if they could take over the two holy sites of Mecca and Medina. I mean, can you imagine that? This is the long-term goal of the Iranian regime. It has always been. And currently, with control of with the Strait of Hormuz, they've reached a point which even the Iranian regime couldn't have imagined. They think, oh my goodness, we're only a one step away. If we can control the straits, we can move on to the landmass of the Arabian Peninsula and do maybe what Saddam Hussein failed to do, which is take over some of those countries. So, I mean, I know it sounds far-fetched at the moment, but who would have
Right.
thought that Iran would be able to have such control over the Straits of Hormuz at the moment? So I think for the GCC, this is a life-critical chance. They either get together create a defense pact with cooperation with the West and with the United States, or they risk losing their countries in the next decade or so.
In the last couple of days, Iranian regime stated clearly and publicly that when everything is over to GCC countries, you will stay with us and geography is our destiny. Recently, New York Times leaked that Americans and Israelis planners are eyeing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as a potential post-regime leader, or at least they considered him. Is this a credible transition strategy or deliberate wartime disinformation?
Well, it's hard to know. First of all, I think that we should be very skeptical of news that we get through obviously the mainstream or through the media, because obviously I'm not saying they're deliberately lying or they are doing disinformation, but the media want to run with a story and with a scoop that they feel they have. And if that information is leaked to them, they may not do enough fact checking or have enough caution. So, first of all, I would be very skeptical of this plan. Now, does it mean that there wasn't some kind of plan like that? It's hard to know without having direct intelligence. It sounds very far fetched. It sounds to me that it was possibly one of many types of feelers that the Americans and the Israelis put out. I mean, it was obviously the case at the beginning of the military operation that President Trump was saying in his speeches that we are talking with a number of people. We're trying to find our equivalent of the Delcy Rodriguez. In other words, we're trying to find someone who is willing to be pragmatic in the sense of working with us. And I'm sure that they put out feelers to a number of people inside the Iranian elite to try to see what the response is. And it's possible that one of those was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. It's interesting. When I was in Iran, a number of businessmen inside Iran who were opposed to the regime, they were anti-regime individuals, had qualified support for Ahmadinejad when he was president, purely from an economic and financial pragmatist point of view, not from an ideological point of view. They supported him only because his administration went ahead and did something that many populist administrations had not been willing to do, and that was reduce subsidies throughout the government. And because Ahmadinejad was labeled as a neoliberal in that sense, but all it meant was that he was willing to put the economy back on a more financially secure footing. I mean, any Islamist or any even fascist or totalitarian can have economic literacy and know that, if Iran is one of the most highly subsidized economies in the world. It has possibly the cheapest gasoline at the pump in the world, which is completely economically unsustainable. It also very highly subsidizes electricity and water and education and health, and all these basic utilities are highly subsidized, which is why the government runs constant deficits and prints money, and so that creates high inflation. And so it is a financially unsustainable model. And Ahmadinejad's government tried to reduce those inefficient subsidies. And so it got the support of people. And people said, well, he seems to be so cynical and self serving. And when Ahmadinejad also was willing to confront the supreme leader because he wanted more power as president, people saw that as an indication that maybe this is someone who is so self serving and so interested in power that he's willing to buck the ideological hierarchy in the Iranian regime.
Right.
Does all of this mean that? All I can say, Amir, is that I think that it's plausible that he was one of several politicians who were approached by Israeli intelligence, either on trips abroad or inside Iran, and spoken to. According to the New York Times, he initially was on board with some kind of collaboration with an American administration, but then he changed his mind later. Now, that could itself have been an Iranian intelligence, counterintelligence operation in which Ahmadinejad works closely with the regime, tells the Americans and Mossad that I will work with you. And so who knows, about
Can
these.
Right, right. Considering the possibility that you mentioned, we all know that psychological warfare rarely happens by accident during a hot war, specifically. Who actually benefits from putting Ahmadinejad's name out there right now?
I mean, I think the people who would benefit would be the IRGC and the hardcore of the regime around the supreme leader. I mean, I think that they would basically indicate that there are traitors amongst our midst, people who are willing to sell us out to the Americans, and don't trust any of the politicians that claim to be pragmatic. So
If
that
what you say is true, then it reinforces the argument that the author of this report has got connection with Islamic Republic.
it's possible, but again, I mean, there are two ways to there are two ways to interpret that. One could interpret this nefariously as to say that this was sort of in collaboration. On the other hand, leaked information coming from the Iranians could just be something that would be picked up anyway, and because it is a professional scoop. So to be honest, Amir, I don't know. I don't feel I'm really in a position to speculate about that. And even though you can point to reporters who have a certain slant, but that doesn't necessarily mean, in my view, that they would actually go out of their way to let's say validate a regime narrative. But they would be less credulous, let's say, in doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think that we could put it down to the desire for newspaper columnists to lead with a scoop story.
Right. So if Washington backs down and signs another temporary deal with this system, aren't they just guaranteeing a much more brutal nuclear armed conflict a few years down the line?
I'm sorry to say, I would have to respond yes. First of all, it would be a strategic and tactical defeat for the United States. It would be a humiliation for the United States. And I think it would show that that the United States is not the hyperpower or superpower that that it claims to be currently, and that unfortunately for the Iranian, so that would be bad for the Americans. That would be bad for America's place in the world, and it would be bad for a world order which up to now and still is backstopped by U.S. military power and U.S. diplomatic power. It would also be, I think, it would be a defeat for the vast majority of Iranians who desire a greater, freer and democratic Iran. It would be a total defeat for them. They would have to live under a regime which is again empowered and still has access to nuclear weapons, still has access to their proxies, and still has access to their ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones. Weakened, of course, but for the many, many millions, 60 million, 70 million Iranians who hoped that maybe this would lead to a freer Iran, I think that they would just lose motivation for the next generation, or maybe, certainly for the next several years and a decade, perhaps. I mean, that that is a very dark and grim interpretation, but unfortunately, I think that if the United States comes to an agreement and accepts any of the maximalist demands of this regime, it would be terrible for the United States and the vast majority of Iranian freedom-loving Iranians.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope this worst case scenario is not going to happen. You mentioned the regime is weakened. Absolutely true. They have lost many high, officials. But the main objectives, uranium enrichment, then missile program, and then, stopping the proxies and us. So before the war, Iran was not controlling the Strait of Hormuz. It wasn't mined, but right now it is added to the list of problems.
Yes, the three objectives, the war aims, were enrichment, ballistic missiles, and proxies. Um, so Iran has managed to has fight the United States to at least a draw, a stalemate. And at most, it has gained a card which it didn't have before. And it's put the United States in a position where the United States is unwilling to use the force, the military force of its navy, to open the straits in a way to make Iran open the straits. So I think that we just have to be honest and say that that is a major victory for the Islamic Republic and a major defeat for the United States currently. That is in the current situation. Now, where I say I partially push back is because if it is true, and of course this all depends on intelligence, which we have to believe, if it is true that Iran's enrichment, the entire enrichment process and nuclear weapons program, and I do believe it's a nuclear weapons program, not just a nuclear energy program, has been pushed back 20 years, and its proxies have been deeply, deeply decimated. They have not, well, I know I wouldn't use the word decimated. I would use deeply degraded, but not decimated. And that the ballistic missile inventory has been reduced. That is, I would say, a partial achievement of the war aims. And that given the costs for the global economy, which Iran has managed to impose, and the United States has planned extremely badly. I mean, remember, every war has a cost. And that unfortunately, even though I believe that the war aims were that the Trump administration began with are reasonable and were understandable and strategically coherent, I believe that the Trump administration has prosecuted this war extremely bad. They didn't do any of the preparation required. Basically, 101 international relations, 101 international diplomacy. Prepare your allies, prepare your partners, prepare your military for all the contingencies that could come out. They did none of that. And so we are paying the price. The US is paying the price for that in the current condition. So partial gains on all three, a loss on the Straits of Hormuz, but what I would say is that it's also important to realize that war is a learning.
Absolutely.
And what Iran feels it's made a gain now could end up being, and most likely will end up being, their weak card, their weak point in the future. As the US begins to adapt and the GCC countries begin to adapt to the new drone and small scale missile technology, Iran's advantage will begin to erode. And as GCC and the US begins to adapt to the risk of Iranian control of the Straits of Hormuz, the entire world economy will begin to adapt too. This is not going to help the Iranian people in any way in the next 10 years. But Iran's ability to press its advantage will reduce, I'm pretty sure, over the medium term, not over the short term, but over the medium term, as basically oil markets begin to adapt. Maybe new supply routes will come from the United States, which is the biggest exporter of petroleum products in the world, and new pipelines maybe across Saudi Arabia land, and new types of things. But as I say, that is something that I think that the Iranian regime will begin to suffer over the medium term, but not in the short term. They will remain in power, gain these advantages. So that would be my qualified pushback. But I think in general, you are right. If the goal was to get Iran to renounce the right for enrichment, and by the way, this was, I believe, mistakenly, if I could be even harshly, foolishly, the Obama administration and the JCPOA accepted Iran's characterization of a right to enrichment. I can't believe the Obama administration did that, because there is no right to enrichment in the NPT. Countries have a right to nuclear energy. They do not have a right to enrich. But the JCPOA accepted that, and of course, the Iranians are not going to come back. give that up easily, if at all. They haven't done that, so that's a failure on the American side. There's no commitment on the Iranian side to cap and limit ballistic missiles yet. And of course, there's no commitment on the Iranian side to stop supporting proxies. So unfortunately, I'd say that at the moment, it looks like a strategic defeat for the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaboration on that part. There is a critical question about transition. With no organized opposition networks left intact inside Iran, can a fragmented diaspora lead a successful transition?
Well, I would say it is very unlikely. That is to say, a strong diaspora could play an important role if it linked up with and bridged an organized opposition on the ground inside Iran. But as you mentioned just now, Amir, there is no organized opposition inside Iran. The regime, since 2009, since the crushing of the Green protests and the Green movement inside Iran, have eliminated and neutralized any organized opposition. The leaders are either in prison or dead or in exile. What was even the reformist parties, and they were Islamic reformist parties, they were the only ones that were legally allowed. They have been banned and dismantled. The opposition, the secular opposition, has always been illegal in Iran. They have no access to newspapers, to state TV or radio, or the ability to mobilize. So there are no leaders. There is no organization, and there is an ideology. There is a kind of civil society ideology, democracy, Western democracy. But unfortunately, Amir, I was looking at some of the public opinion surveys inside Iran, and one of them did catch my eye, and I think it's worth dwelling on because I think it indicates maybe how hard it would be under the current circumstances for a secular opposition to have much traction amongst the population. There was a question in a number of surveys, some of which I think we can assess as reasonably reliable, not completely reliable, let's say plausible. There was one question, for example, that asked people, would you be willing to establish, would you approve of Iran or the Iranian regime or government or whatever, however it was worded, establishing formal relations with the United States in a situation where you would have to give up the nuclear program and cap and limit ballistic missiles? That was a very interesting question because it is very rare in surveys to clarify what a cost of something is, as opposed to just a desire.
Right.
And a vast majority of a very large national sample said no. I think it was 60 to 70% of the population said we would not, that we would not approve of establishing relations with the United States if we had to give up our nuclear program and cap our ballistic missiles. Now, put this against side by side with two other survey questions. One other survey question was simply, would you approve that the Iran becomes closer to the United States without cost on the other side? And 60% approved of that. 60, 70% approved of that. And then there's another question which said, would you approve the same, in the same question, which with the people who were asked, would you approve of, in other words, the 60% who said we would approve establishing closer relations with the United States said 60, 70%, but we would not approve of establishing closer relations with Israel. Now, that suggests to me that if I was in Iran, and I thought about this the other day, and I'll just share this with you, and I wonder what you think. If I was in Iran and there was a free ability to, let's say, start a campaign, the campaign I would start in Iran, or at least I would be interested to see how much traction it would have, would be the campaign which said, okay, everyone, I want you to support this position. We demand of the Islamic Republic of Iran that it accepts the three demands that the United States has made in this war: eliminate enrichment, cap and limit ballistic missiles, and stop supporting proxies. In return, we will establish close relations and we will have economic growth.
Right.
And that would be a kind of like campaign. I mean, imagine if there was like a change.org possibility in Iran, or we do it through the WhatsApp.
But I don't know if you agree. I believe you agree, but let's ask the question. So, if it is conducted in Iran, there is always question about credibility and reliability of the results, so it is not a free democratic country that people can express their opinions freely. And even so-called free elections are manipulated, in order to get the result that the system wants.
Yeah, let me just comment on that. First of all, I don't believe there are free and fair elections in Iran. There have never been free and fair elections in Iran. They are both manipulated and violate all basic norms of what we understand as electoral integrity, internationally understood. So that's in terms of elections. In terms of surveys, it's a little more complicated. I did soon I'll be publishing the results of a 1-year research project that I have done with a team, which I think is the first time this has ever been done. We have collected and studied, I think, every major public opinion survey that has been conducted in on Iranians over the last 25 years. And we have experts look at the methodology at these various things, and we've ranked the various public surveys, public opinion surveys. We've tried to evaluate them very closely, looking at scientific methodology, assessments, and so forth. And we give them a rank of reliability from low to medium to high. Not all of them are high. Very few of them are high. Some of them do get ranked as medium reliability. And it is one of the peculiarities of Iran that that even though people are not free to mobilize or to organize or to oppose the government, they do not always feel reluctant to express opinions in surveys. And so what I'm trying to say is report, and I can't go into details now, but hopefully we'll publish these results. Some surveys do actually reflect what we see, some surprising results. In other words, why, many people do criticize the regime in some of these surveys. And so we try to use some scientific methodology to correct for what we understand as polling distortions in authoritarian systems. We have experience in China and other places like this. So that's just to say that we try to take this into account. Yes, it's not totally free, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest is what my takeaway from this is that under the current circumstances in Iran, it would be very hard for a diaspora. I mean, I believe that the majority of the Iranian diaspora who support a liberal democracy in Iran, a regime change or a transition to a more democratic and liberal and pro-Western democracy, if they were if they were given the chance of supporting let's say a referendum position saying, do you support the Iranian government accepting the demands that the US and the Western world has put on Iran? I would suggest that a majority of the diaspora would say yes. We do accept that. In other words, we accept there's no reason Iran needs to have enrichment. I mean, a majority, not all, would say we don't need a nuclear weapons program. There should be full transparency. There should be full inspections, which there never has been. The Islamic regime has never permitted a full, transparent inspection regime to check out and evaluate the nuclear program. And we'll work with powers to cap and limit our ballistic missiles so that we could only have defensive weapons, which every country should have. And yes, we don't need to support terrorist proxies throughout the region. So the famous slogan, not not Gaza, not Lebanon. I give my life for Iran. Janam Fadai Iran, if that's the right one. So
Right.
that would be a position. Now, my worry is, given the nationalist feeling, given 47 years of anti-Israeli and anti-American propaganda, you'll have a lot of people inside Iran who the combination of this would lead them to be reluctant to support a position like that. And I think if I was a political activist in the West trying to make connections with groups in Iran, I would have to think about that very carefully. I don't know whether that would create great traction. In other words, it would get in the way of a democracy mobilization inside of Iran.
Right.
I don't know whether that was clear, but I'm trying to think through this trade-off, given the war now with Iran and Israel on the side. It may accentuate these anti-Israeli, anti-American feelings.
Professor Tajbakhsh, is there anything that we haven't talked about, but you think it's absolutely crucial to mention?
What I would like to point out, and I think that we should remember, is that even if the regime has won a tactical victory, I would suggest this to be a tactical victory. I mean, some people would say it's a strategic victory. I'm not going to quibble with words. I would say that it is a short-term victory, or at least a short-term gain. Over time, I think that the regime will erode its gain. In other words, it has playing the one card it has now, which is the Hormuz Straits. And that card will be slowly eroded over time. I think it's important for people inside Iran to keep that in mind, not to lose perspective or lose hope for change over the medium term. And then second, I would say that perhaps the woman life freedom movement, in which women now are walking in the streets of Iran without hijab, has been the largest social gain that has been won at a very high cost of young women and men who were killed and imprisoned because of that. That is something to value and to deepen over time. For now, that seems to be the weapons of the weak. And hopefully over time, the civil society in Iran will become much stronger and to be able to persuade more Iranians that their future for their children and for future generations, for a thriving life, for a more spiritual life, for a more free, even religious life, depends on moving beyond the limited parameters of the Islamic regime and rejoining the international world at a time. And they should also remember, I think this is the last thing I'd say, that the world is going towards a new kind of Cold War in which there is an axis of authoritarianism, which is bringing together China, Russia, and North Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran, people should keep in mind that for people who want to live in a free Iran, that is not the camp that they want to be in the future. So they should not be indifferent to the way in which Iran gets closer to China and to Russia. That will be, I think, bad news for a more thriving civil society inside Iran for the future. So Iran needs to join the camp in the West and be integrated into the international economy, and hopefully that will happen at some point. But at the moment, I think there should be patience and hope.
Professor Tajbakhsh, thank you for bringing exceptional clarity to a chaotic moment in history.
Thank you very much, Amir.